The 10th oldest state in the United States is having an election in 2025. Virginia voters will decide who should be running their state for the next 4 years. My guest, Sam Shirazi, a Virginia elections expert, is here to break down Virginia's 2025 election. He joins me now.
Yeah, thanks so
Thank
much
you,
for having
Sam,
me.
for coming onto the program.
Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about Virginia elections always.
So first things first, we'll get into the statewide races and the electorate in a second, but how did you become interested in Virginia politics?
Sure. So I moved to Virginia in 2006, and that was really an exciting moment to be in Virginia because it was at that moment where Virginia went from a red state to a purple state, and now maybe it's arguably a light blue state. So I've been following Virginia politics for a long time. I would say I got involved more in 2021 with the governor's race. There was also redistricting in 2021. And so it's a little bit of deja vu in 2005. There's a governor's race, there's some redistricting potentially happening in Virginia. So a lot of stuff. Virginia's always kind of an interesting state because not quite a super blue state, competitive usually, and yeah, I've just always enjoyed following what's been going on in Virginia, and especially this year with the governor's race.
And your passion for Virginia politics is manifested into a podcast called the Federal Fallout Podcast. What is that podcast about?
Yeah, I should have made the pitch, so I appreciate that you've brought it up. Podcast is specifically about the elections this year in Virginia. So I go over a lot of different things. The reason it was called Federal Fallout was just trying to think through what the impact of the changes in DC would mean for the elections in Virginia. Obviously, Virginia, right across the Potomac from DC, there were a lot of cuts to the federal government, had an impact on the Virginia economy. My thought has been that that would impact the elections this year in Virginia, and we will get the final answer on Tuesday, depending on how the results come in on Tuesday night.
For those who live outside of Virginia, why should they care about Virginia's elections?
Right. So Virginia is the first big test of the administration that comes into power in January. So January of this year, there's obviously a new administration, and the public and the nation always looks to Virginia as a bellwether. This year, New Jersey is also getting a decent amount of attention. New Jersey traditionally has been a bluer state than Virginia. I think one thing that'll be really interesting this year in Virginia is to see if is Virginia going to be bluer than New Jersey potentially. And I think overall, I think the margin this year in Virginia will be looked at really closely because if Democrats get a big win, I think that'll be an indication that maybe they're going to be doing well next year in the midterms. Obviously, if Republicans, even if they don't win, if they keep it close in Virginia and New Jersey, I think that might be an indication that they might do better next year in the midterms. And so I think everyone's just always keeping an eye on Virginia, and now also New Jersey is going to get a lot of attention this year.
Would you say Virginia is the ultimate bellwether state?
I think there was a few years when that was true. Certainly when President Obama in 2008 won Virginia for the first time in 44 years. That was a big moment. I think 2008, 2012, Virginia was certainly like the one of the main toss-up battleground states. I think since that time, particularly in the Trump era, Virginia has moved more into the Democratic column. So I would describe it as a light blue state. So don't think of it as, out of the 50 states, I don't necessarily think it's the top bellwether. But I think, there obviously aren't that many elections this year. And of the elections this year, I think most people are going to be keeping an eye on Virginia and New Jersey because both of those states, while they have are now more thought of as blue states, they aren't, super blue state like Massachusetts or California.
Let's talk about voting and the electorate. When you look at Virginia, it's a state that really opens up its early voting. And please correct me if I'm wrong, in September. How do campaigns and candidates navigate early voting to be that early, considering that there were still debates taking place over the last few weeks?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the unique things about Virginia. There's 45 days of in-person early voting, and some people argue that's too much early voting. The reality is, I think it gives people some flexibility. There is a risk when you vote it's in September, potentially things could happen. And obviously a lot of things have happened in September that in theory could change people's minds. But the reality is the people who vote early, like in September, are like the hardcore partisan people. So I would be surprised if any of them really change their mind. You find that the people who vote latest, and especially on election day, tend to be less engaged, less partisan people. And so while I think early voting makes sense, both campaigns have encouraged their voters to vote early. I don't think it really affects the overall outcome when things happen late in the game, because at the end of the day, as I said, most partisan people vote early, and then the least partisan people tend to vote later. So those undecided swing voters, they tend to want to see what happens in the closing days of the campaign, and a lot of them will just vote on election day.
In terms of the electorate, sometimes political experts will break down by party affiliation, but I want to ask you about regions and urban, suburban, and rural. What are the differences between urban voters, suburban voters, and rural voters? The issues that, not only the issues that they care about, but the ideological leanings of voters in those areas?
Yeah, so in Virginia, the real difference is between the rural areas versus the suburban urban areas. So the rural areas are very red. Those are traditionally more conservative Republican areas for the most part. I mean, there are some exceptions, but that's generally the rule. I think the urban areas tend to be more Democratic. And for a long time, the battleground has been the suburbs. Suburbs where and still most of the competitive seats in the House of Delegates, which are up for election, are in the suburbs. Because obviously that's where the urban and rural areas tend to collide. I think what has changed in the last 10, 20 years that has made Virginia a light blue state is that the suburbs have become more Democratic. And you think of a place like Northern Virginia, suburbs of DC, a lot of voters, and those voters have become very Democratic. And I think this election, what you're going to see is Republicans doing well in the rural areas, Democrats doing well in the urban areas. The question mark are the suburbs. If I had to guess, particularly at the top of the ticket, the Democrats are going to be doing well in the suburbs. And so that's kind of the regional dynamic within Virginia.
And now to party affiliation, even though before we started this broadcast, you had informed me that Virginia doesn't really view that party affiliation is not really a factor, correct? That party affiliation is not people don't register by party. Is that correct?
Yeah, so Virginia has this unique system where you basically just register to vote, and you don't pick Democrat, Republican, third party. You basically just register to vote. And I think it makes it a little bit hard to model sometimes, because you don't know necessarily 100% are these people coming out are Democrats or Republicans. I will say that both parties and independent groups try to model based on primary history, based on demographics. Okay, they think this person's a Republican, they think this person's a Democrat, but it's not 100%. And it's unlike, for example, in New Jersey, there is party registration. You can see literally these people are registered Democrats or Republicans. They're coming out. You can't do that in Virginia. I think that creates a little bit of uncertainty. Generally, I would say there's probably, I'm just making up numbers, but I'd say there's slightly more Democrats than Republicans in Virginia, particularly if you take into account independents. So independents in Virginia, I would say, tend to lean towards the Democrats, not 100% of the time, but obviously most elections statewide, Democrats tend to end up winning. So I would say in Virginia, there are probably more Democrats than Republicans in most elections, but there isn't any sort of kind of formal way to track that based on party registration.
Just curious, in terms of, even though you don't register by party in Virginia, you did mention independent voters. What are some issues, if you don't know, it's okay, but what are some issues that independent voters care most about in Virginia?
Yeah, so if you look at most of the polls, the top issue is typically the economy. And I think specifically for independent voters, they usually view the economy as the top issue. Why? Because they aren't so ideological. They don't necessarily have these really partisan issues they care about, like the left and the right might. And just because you're an independent, it doesn't mean you don't lean conservative or liberal. It just means you don't necessarily affiliate with either party. And I think the reality is most people, their top concern is the economy. And that's even more true for independents because they choose not to be Democrats or Republicans because they may not ideologically be so committed to some of the causes that generally make someone a Democrat or a Republican.
In certain states, such as Vermont, there's a third party called the Vermont Progressive Party that has enjoyed electoral success. There's no momentum for third parties really in Virginia, correct?
That's generally true. There was a time period about 10 years ago when the Libertarian Party was doing okay in Virginia. So in the 2013 election, the Republicans nominated a very socially conservative candidate, and the Libertarians ended up running a candidate who I think got maybe around 5%, which was a historic high for a third party in Virginia. Since that time, the Libertarians haven't really been able to replicate that. So I will say, in terms of the third party that's probably the strongest in Virginia, it's the Libertarian Party. But this year, they're not running any candidates for the statewide offices. And I'd say, in the last 10 years, their strength has kind of weakened.
Let's go into the statewide races, but first, an interesting poll that you had shared on Blue Sky here and connecting with your podcast and the federal government shutdown. When you look at blame for the government shutdown, according to this SoCal Virginia poll, 40% say the Republicans, 32% say the Democrats, and 25% say both. What impact will the federal government shutdown have on this election in Virginia?
Yeah, I think that's kind of a big wild card because even though, you don't necessarily hear about it every single day in the news, and in parts of the country, it might not be a big deal, but Virginia shutdown is a big deal, specifically in Northern Virginia. So Northern Virginia, a lot of federal employees, a lot of federal contractors, and you are seeing the impact of the federal shutdown in Northern Virginia. And I think there is a scenario where the Democrats, particularly in Northern Virginia, get a little bit of a bump because of the shutdown. As you see in the poll, more people blame the Republicans than the Democrats. I think there's if I had to guess, I think the hardcore partisan Democrats blame the Republicans. For whatever reason, the Republicans are blaming both, or there just isn't as much blame for the Democrats. And I think at the end of the day, one of the things that'll be interesting to see is there that kind of regional dynamic where the Democrats do even better than they normally do in Northern Virginia and also Hampton Roads. So Hampton Roads, places like Virginia Beach, Norfolk, a lot of federal presence, more on the military side, but a shutdown also affects those areas. So kind of interesting to see if there are big swings in Northern Virginia, Hampton Roads, both because of some of the federal firings and because of the shutdown.
Now, finally, to the statewide races, the governor race. You posted this YouGov Virginia poll showing Abigail Spanberger, the Democrat, with a 15-point lead. Again, some polls have Spanberger less than a 15-point lead. But do you think Spanberger is basically on her way to victory?
Yeah, I mean, I think most people think that Spanberger is going to win. Most of the polls show, I think basically every single poll shows her winning. This poll was a little bit of an outlier in that it showed such a big win for Spanberger. I don't know if she's going to win by 15%. I think that's kind of the best case scenario for Democrats. Most of the nonpartisan polls have her closer to 10% win. And I think the margin is going to be really important for governor. It's less about who's going to win because I think most people think Spanberger is going to win. It's the margin. And in 2017, obviously, first time Trump was in the White House, the Democrat Ralph Northam won the governor's race in Virginia by 9%. And I think that's going to be an important number. Is Spanberger going to win more than 9% or less than 9%? I think obviously Republicans are hoping for less than 9%. They're going to say that's a good night. Democrats are not doing as well as they did in 2017. Democrats want to win by more than 9% so they can say, look, we're doing better than we did in 2017. And the backlash Trump is going to be even stronger this time than it was in 2017.
Even though a generic ballot, this poll by SoCal Virginia shows the Democrats with a 7-point lead in this generic ballot situation. However, when you look at the AG race poll, it's really tight, down to 2%. What is the reason behind the tightening of the AG race?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't know if people followed what happened in the Attorney General race. Very unique situation. So early October, there was a news report about some text that Jay Jones, who's the Attorney General candidate for the Democrats, had sent to a Republican delegate a few years ago, where he basically made some inappropriate remarks, talked about violence, about a colleague in the Republican colleague in the House of Delegates. He's come out, he's apologized for that. Obviously, it's something that is not a good story for him, and I think the Republicans are really trying to seize upon that and to, if they can't win the governor's race, at least win the attorney general race. And the Republican is an incumbent, so he already had a little bit of an advantage because he's an incumbent. I think before the tech story came out, most people thought that Jay Jones would win because straight ticket voting, Spamberger was going to win by a lot at the top of the ticket, and that would be enough for Jay Jones. The question now is there going to be ticket splitting? So ticket splitting is someone voting for governor for Abigail Spamberger, and then at the attorney general spot will vote for the Republican, Jason Miyares. I think that's certainly going to happen. The question is how much? Is it going to be 1%, 2%, 5%? And I think the margin at the top of the ticket is going to be really important. If Spamberger is winning, closer to 7%, I think that's the scenario where the Republicans can win the attorney general race. If Spamberger is winning by about 10%, that's about, it's going to be close. I think, for example, if Spamberger is winning like she's doing in the YouGov poll, 15%, I think almost certainly Jay Jones is going to win. So while you can look at the margin at the attorney general spot in these polls, both candidates are typically below 50% because there's a lot of undecideds. And I think as much as the attorney general margin will matter, it really might be decided at the top of the ticket. And so you're seeing the Republicans, even if they know they might not win the governor's race, they're trying to get as best of an outcome as possible in the governor's race in the hopes that maybe in the attorney general race, the Republican incumbent might be able to hang on.
Last question about voting, and then we'll get your last thoughts to end the broadcast. How common is split ticket voting in Virginia compared to other states?
So I think a long time ago, it was more common because people were less partisan. So for example, in 2001, you had a Democrat and a Democratic governor and attorney general who was a Republican. The last time there's been any sort of ticket splitting outcome has been in 2005. So in that year, you had a Democratic governor, and then you had a Republican lieutenant governor, and then you had a Republican attorney general. Every single election since then, 2009, 2013, 2017, 2021, the party that won the governor's race also won the lieutenant governor's race, also won the attorney general race. So I think the thought has been not too much ticket splitting anymore in Virginia. People just tend to vote straight ticket. Why? Because people are partisan. And frankly, people don't necessarily take the time to investigate every single race. They just kind of pick one party and go down the ballot. This year will be kind of the ultimate test if that changes. I mean, I think if the Republicans are able to win the attorney general race, kind of shows that in maybe extraordinary circumstances, ticket splitting could still be alive. I think if Jay Jones wins the attorney general race, I think very clearly it's kind of the triumph of partisanship, the triumph of straight ticket voting. And realistically, it's very difficult to overcome a bad outcome at the top of the ticket if you are a party that's going to lose the governor's race or the top of the ticket race.
Before we end the broadcast, I give everyone a chance to give their final words. You could plug your podcast, anything that you want to say. The floor is yours, Sam.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I mean, I definitely would recommend people to listen to my podcast. Where you find your podcast, just search Federal Fallout. I think, if you don't live in Virginia and you are tuning in on Tuesday night trying to figure out what's going on, keep an eye out for the margin at the top of the ticket. How big of a win does Spamberger get? And remember the 9% margin that the Democrats got in 2017. So I think if you are seeing Spamberger win by 10% or more, kind of a double-digit win, I think Democrats and also the media will say, wow, Spamberger is doing a really good job. Democrats are doing well. They may potentially have a good shot at flipping at least the House of Representatives in 2018. I think if Spamberger is not doing as well as expected, maybe winning by 7 or 8, I think Republicans are going to try to paint that as a win, and the media might say, oh, well, Trump's more popular, and the Republicans might be able to hold the House. So as much as the Virginia elections matter, they're kind of important for people who live in Virginia. Ultimately, this is kind of the first preview of what's going to happen in 2018 when the midterms happen, and obviously the midterms are going to be really important next year. So definitely pay attention on election night. You can check out my podcast. You can find me on social media. I will be posting a lot between now and election day. So I appreciate the opportunity to come on, and always happy to talk about Virginia elections.
Great, Sam, for being on the show. And that is the end of the interview. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.